The wind clawed across the barren stretch of prairie, carrying with it a low whistle that cut through the silence like a knife. The sky above was bruised with shades of gray, heavy clouds dragging their weight across the horizon. A solitary figure stood on the porch of a weather-beaten cabin, his frame outlined against the dim light of early evening. He was a cowboy, though few still called him that. His hat was pulled low, brimmed shadowing eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing more. He was not old. Not yet, but hardship had carved its map across his face. His hands were scarred, strong but stiff from long years of work and longer years of loneliness. The land around him was quiet, except for the whisper of wind and the occasional groan of wood in the cabin walls. He had built this place himself, plank by plank, years ago when he thought solitude would be a cure for wounds that never healed. A wife once, and a child too, both buried before the ground thawed that spring. Since then, silence had been his companion. It was better, he told himself, than hope. Hope was a liar, and lies had no place in the frontier. Yet tonight, something unsettled him, a sense that the world was shifting, even here, far from the chatter of towns and the weight of laws. He tightened the worn leather strap on his rifle, leaning it against the porch rail. His eyes scanned the edge of the trees where the prairie met the forest, searching. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, sharp with the hint of a storm. He expected nothing. Still, his body held the readiness of a man who had lived too long by instinct. Then he saw her. At first, only a shadow stumbling between the trees. Small, uneven, fragile against the darkening woods. He narrowed his eyes, hand hovering over the rifle, though he did not yet lift it. She came closer, the outline of her form taking shape in the fading light. A woman, young but not a child, clothes torn and dirt-streaked, face pale under the smear of blood along her brow. She moved as though every step carried a weight too heavy to bear, yet still she came on, pulled by some desperate will. When she reached the clearing, she faltered, half collapsing onto the grass. For a moment, she simply lay there, breath ragged, chest rising and falling with painful effort. The cowboy did not move. He watched, stone-faced, as if frozen between action and stillness. He had seen refugees before, lost souls wandering west with little but hunger and fear in their eyes. They came and they went, sometimes with stories, sometimes with nothing but silence. But something in the way this woman struggled against her own weakness struck him. He stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the damp soil. She lifted her head, eyes dark and sharp despite exhaustion. He realized then that she was not like the others he had seen. Her features marked her as foreign, Chinese, far from any place where she might have belonged in this land. Her lips trembled, forming words in broken English. "Help, please." 2 words, enough to break the silence of his world. He hesitated. To take her in was to invite trouble. Settlers nearby, men who already carried suspicion and hatred in their hearts, would never tolerate it. They had their own reasons, born from fear, ignorance, and bitterness. He knew too well what it meant to stand against them. Still, the image of his wife's face, drawn pale with fever, flickered in his mind. The memory of his child's cry that winter night, fading into silence, cut deeper than the cold ever had. No one had come to help them. No one but him, and he had failed. His jaw clenched. He reached down and lifted her gently, surprised at how light she was, how fragile her body felt against his arms. She flinched at his touch, instinctive fear tightening her muscles, but she did not resist. He carried her toward the cabin, pushing the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the room was sparse. A small table, a bed of rough wood, a hearth with fire embers faintly glowing. He laid her down on the bed, pulling a blanket over her trembling form. Her eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, as though expecting pursuers to burst through the walls at any moment. He poured water into a tin cup and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, coughing as the water burned down her throat, then gasped for air. He studied her, saying nothing. Silence was his language, and he waited for her to speak. "My name." "My," she whispered, each word strained. "They want to kill me." The cowboy said nothing at first, though his chest tightened at the sound of fear in her voice. Her accent was heavy, her English fractured, but the meaning was clear. She had enemies. Whoever they were, they would come. He set the cup aside, eyes lowering to the rifle leaning near the door. "Why?" His voice was low. Gravel dragged over stone. She struggled to sit, shaking her head. "I ran. They think I don't belong. Work, railroad, men, they chase." Her words broke, fragments torn by exhaustion. "I run." Her gaze fell to his hands, calloused and rough, as if searching for judgment there. He gave none, only turned away to stoke the fire. The flames flared, casting their faces in shifting light. "You're safe here tonight," he said, though even as he spoke, he wondered if it was true. Outside, the wind howled louder. As the night deepened, he kept watch by the window, his rifle across his lap. She slept fitfully, murmuring in a language he did not understand, her hands clutching the blanket as though afraid it would be ripped from her. He saw in her what he had seen in himself years ago, someone hunted not only by others but by the ghosts of memory. Hours passed. The storm broke, rain lashing against the roof, thunder growling across the hills. Lightning revealed the dark silhouette of riders at the edge of the woods, still and watchful. His muscles tightened. He knew trouble when he saw it. They had found her. He turned back to the bed. She stirred, eyes opening wide, fear rushing in. "They come," she whispered. "I see them." For a long moment, their eyes locked, a silent agreement passing between them. He had chosen already, though he had not said it aloud. He would not hand her over, no matter the cost. Perhaps it was madness, perhaps redemption. Either way, the choice was made. He moved to the door, checking the rifle, sliding a handful of cartridges into his belt. His heart beat with the calm rhythm of a man who had accepted the storm he was about to face. Outside, the shadows shifted, more figures gathering, waiting for dawn or courage to push them forward. Behind him, she rose from the bed, unsteady but determined. She clutched the edge of the table for balance, her face pale but her eyes fierce. He almost told her to rest, but the words caught in his throat. She had fought too hard to reach his door. She was no longer a stranger. The rain eased, leaving the night heavy with the smell of wet earth and smoke from the fire. He stepped onto the porch again, watching the tree line where torches flickered faintly against the dark. They were waiting, 70 strong perhaps, though he could not yet count them. Farmers, settlers, men hardened by fear and anger. Against them stood one man, and a woman barely able to stand. Still, he did not waver. The night stretched on, the riders silent in their vigil. He returned inside, set the rifle against the wall, and lowered himself into a chair. She sat across from him, silent, staring at the floor. The fire crackled between them, its light the only warmth in the room. "You should sleep," he said quietly. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Instead, she drew the blanket tighter around herself and closed her eyes, though he knew she would not find rest. He leaned back, eyes heavy but mind sharp, listening to the rhythm of rain dripping from the eaves, the distant shuffle of restless horses. The storm had passed, but another storm, greater and more dangerous, was gathering just beyond the trees. When the first pale streak of dawn touched the horizon, he rose. His bones ached, but his resolve was steel. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch once more. Across the clearing, the settlers were there, torches flaring in the morning light, rifles gleaming. The air hummed with tension, brittle and sharp. He knew then that this day would not pass without blood. And still he stood. The dawn's pale light stretched thin across the clearing, washing the faces of the men waiting at the tree line in hues of gray and gold. 70 settlers, their torches guttering in the cool wind, stood like a wall of judgment. The cowboy watched them, expression carved from stone, his body still though every muscle hummed with tension. Behind him, Mai shifted, her breath trembling in the silence. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath, balanced between the choice of retreat or violence. But the men did not advance. They lingered, muttering among themselves, eyes fixed on the cabin. Their hesitation was a gift, a sliver of borrowed time. The cowboy turned back inside, closing the door with steady hands, though inside his chest his heart beat hard enough to rattle bone. "They wait?" Mai whispered, voice frayed. He nodded, setting the rifle against the wall. "They'll come. Not now, but they'll come." The weight of that truth pressed heavy in the cabin's air. Mai sank onto the chair by the fire, her body still weak though her eyes carried an ember of determination. The cowboy busied himself with small tasks, checking the shutters, stoking the fire, setting water to boil. Each motion was deliberate, a soldier's ritual to ward off fear. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the land slick with rain and alive with the scent of pine and earth. Inside, the silence was sharp. Finally, Mai spoke again, her voice small but clear. "Why you help me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. He paused, his back to her, hands clenched around the handle of the kettle. He thought of his wife, her face drawn with sickness, the fever that stole her breath. He thought of the child who had never seen spring. He thought of how no one had come to their aid. "Because no one helped mine," he said at last, voice low, as if speaking too loud might break something fragile inside him. Mai's gaze softened, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. She did not press further. She only nodded, as though the answer was enough, as though she understood more than words could hold. The hours passed slow. The settlers remained outside, a constant weight on the air. Hunger gnawed at them both, but food was scarce. He shared dried meat and bread, tearing it in half, pushing the larger piece toward her. She hesitated, then took it with quiet gratitude. As night fell, the forest stirred. The wind carried new sounds, low howls, soft padding in the undergrowth. The cowboy stiffened, ears sharp. Wolves, drawn close by the scent of vulnerability. He rose, taking the rifle, eyes scanning the dark beyond the window. "They come," Mai asked, fear quick in her voice. "Not them. Not yet." He stepped outside, boots sinking in wet earth, rifle raised. The sky was thick with stars now, the moon a pale coin slipping between clouds. From the shadows, eyes gleamed. For 6, maybe more, wolves, hungry and restless. They prowled at the edge of the clearing, circling, their growls rumbling through the night air. The cowboy stood firm, shoulders squared. He fired a warning shot, the crack splitting the silence, echoing off the hills. The wolves flinched, retreating into shadow, but he knew they would return. Hunger had no fear. As he lowered the rifle, a rustle sounded behind him, different from the wolves' tread. He spun, rifle up, but froze at the sight. A man stood near the tree line, tall and broad, cloaked in deerskin, his face painted with ash and earth. A warrior, silent as stone, watching. The cowboy's finger hovered on the trigger, but the warrior did not move. The two men regarded each other across the clearing, neither speaking. The warrior's gaze was unreadable, dark eyes reflecting both curiosity and warning. Then, with slow precision, he raised his hand, not in threat, but in stillness, as if marking truce. The cowboy lowered his rifle, though his body stayed taut. The warrior stepped forward, entering the clearing. Mai, watching from the cabin doorway, gasped softly, but the warrior's attention never shifted from the cowboy. Without a word, he bent, touched the earth, then straightened. His presence was neither hostile nor friendly. It was something else, a force of its own. The cowboy nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. The warrior gave no reply, only turned his gaze toward the forest where the wolves prowled. From his belt, he drew a long knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. Together, without speaking, the two men stood guard as the wolves pressed closer. When the attack came, it was sudden. Dark shapes lunged from the trees, teeth flashing. The cowboy fired, one wolf dropping mid-leap. The warrior moved with fierce grace, blade striking fast, cutting another down. Snarl filled the clearing, claws scraping against wood as one wolf tried to scramble onto the porch. Mai cried out, grabbing a piece of firewood, striking at it with desperate strength. The wolf yelped, retreating into the dark. The battle was brief but savage. When silence returned, 3 wolves lay still on the ground, their blood dark against the wet earth. The rest melted back into the forest, defeated for now. The cowboy's chest heaved, rifle barrel smoking. The warrior wiped his blade clean on the grass, expression unchanged. They looked at each other again, breath mixing in the cool air. No words were needed. Respect had been forged in blood. Inside, Mai trembled, clutching the firewood like a weapon. When the men entered, she stared at the warrior with wide eyes, fear and unmingling. He ignored her gaze, moving to sit by the fire as though the cabin were his own. The cowboy closed the door, setting the rifle aside. For a long while, the three sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering across faces lined with fatigue and secrets. It was Mai who broke the silence. Her voice was soft, but steady now. "You both fight, like Storm." The cowboy glanced at her, then at the warrior. The warrior gave no sign he understood her words, yet his stillness carried its own meaning. Slowly, trust began to take root, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments. The cowboy tending Mai's wound with rough hands, Mai offering food to a warrior though he did not take it, the warrior keeping watch by the window while the others rested. Their bond was built not by choice, but by necessity, by the simple truth that survival bound them tighter than fear could drive them apart. As the night deepened, stories bled into silence. Mai spoke haltingly of her journey, of leaving her village, of work on the railroad, of men who treated her as less than human. Her voice cracked, but she did not cry. She spoke with the strength of someone who had carried pain too long to let it break her now. The cowboy listened, jaw tight, anger flickering in his chest, not at her, but at the cruelty she had endured. He shared little of his own past, only fragments. A wife, a child, graves on a hill. His voice was flat, but his eyes gave him away. Mai's hand brushed his for a moment, a silent offering of understanding. He did not pull away. The warrior said nothing, but in his silence there was a weight, a presence that anchored them all. He was a man who spoke in actions, not words. And yet, when Mai looked at him, she did not see menace. She saw the same thing she saw in the cowboy, a survivor. The hours crawled, and outside the settlers waited, their torches glowing faint through the cracks in the shutters. Their patience was not infinite. Dawn would bring reckoning. Near midnight, a gust of wind rattled the walls. Mai stirred, restless, her face pale. "They come tomorrow," she whispered. The cowboy's gaze hardened. "Then tomorrow we stand." The warrior looked at him, eyes steady, and gave the barest nod. It was enough. Silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the steady drip of rain from the eaves. In that silence lay truth, the truth of who they were, of what they feared, of what they would fight for. Free souls bound by chance, by choice, by the shadow of a battle yet to come. As the first faint glow of dawn touched the sky, the cowboy rose, shoulders heavy with the weight of what awaited. He looked once at Mai, her face calm despite the storm outside, then at the warrior, whose hand rested on the hilt of his blade. Beyond the cabin walls, the settlers stirred, their voices rising, their anger sharpening into resolve. The circle was tightening. The cowboy gripped his rifle, breath steady. The night had given them truths. The day would demand blood. The morning broke sharp and unforgiving, the kind of dawn that stripped away illusions and left only truth behind. The settlers had gathered in force. Their ranks stretched across the clearing like a tide of resentment and fear. 70 men stood with rifles and torches, their faces set hard, their voices murmuring low with anger. The air itself felt brittle, waiting to shatter at the first spark. Inside the cabin, the cowboy checked his rifle, fingers steady though the weight of the moment pressed against him like a grinding stone. Beside him, Mai stood wrapped in the blanket, her face pale but her eyes unflinching. She had no weapon but the courage in her gaze, and somehow it steadied him more than any steel could. The warrior waited near the window, silent, his knife and bow ready. He did not speak, but his presence was like the roots of a tree, deep, immovable. The cowboy stepped onto the porch, rifle slung across his chest, boots thudding against the worn boards. The settlers stirred at his appearance, their murmurs rising into a rough chorus of demands. The leader stepped forward, a broad man with a beard streaked gray, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Send her out. She don't belong here. You know it. We know it. Hand her over and we'll leave you in peace." The cowboy stood tall, shoulders squared. "She's under my roof. She stays." A ripple of anger ran through the crowd, voices shouting, fists raised. The leader spat into the dirt, eyes narrowing. "You're making her trouble your trouble. Think you can stand against 70. The cowboy's jaw clenched. "I've stood against worse." For a moment, silence stretched, taut as a pulled rope. Then the leader lifted his hand, and rifles rose in unison. The cowboy moved back inside, closing the door. He met Mai's eyes. Fear trembled there, but beneath it, something stronger burned. "They'll kill you for me," she whispered. "They'll kill us both if we let them." The warrior's gaze flicked between them, unreadable, then returned to the window. He raised his bow, arrow knocked, waiting. The cowboy loaded his rifle, hands moving with practiced precision. Outside, the settlers shouted, their voices beating like drums. The first shot cracked the morning open. A bullet splintered wood from the cabin door. The cowboy dropped low, rifle to his shoulder, and fired back. A settler cried out, falling, his torch tumbling into the wet grass. Chaos erupted. Gunfire roared. With splintered, smoke filled the air. Inside the cabin, the world became thunder and fire. Mai crouched low, covering her ears, eyes wide as bullets tore through the walls. The warrior loosed an arrow, silent and swift, striking a man down before he could reload. The cowboy fired again, each shot precise, each breath measured. He had fought before, and the rhythm returned to him now, grim and relentless. The settlers surged, some advancing with torches, others firing from the tree line. The cabin shook under the assault, the walls riddled with holes, light streaming through in jagged shafts. Still, the three held their ground. The cowboy felt the burn of a bullet graze his arm, tearing flesh, but he did not falter. Pain sharpened him, anchored him. He reloaded, fired, reloaded, his body machine driven by resolve. The warrior moved with deadly grace, his knife flashing when one settler broke through the window, dragging him back into the date before his torch could touch the floor. Smoke thickened, choking the air. Mai coughed, eyes watering, but she did not collapse. Instead, she crawled to the table, grabbing a pot of boiling water from a fire. When another settler forced the door, she hurled it into his face. His scream tore through the gunfire, and he fell back, clutching his blistered skin. The cowboy glanced at her, and for the first time since this began, his lips curved into the barest shadow of a smile. She was not just surviving, she was fighting. The battle raged on, minutes stretching into eternity. Bodies fell. Torches hissed out in the wet earth, but still the settlers pressed, driven by fury and numbers. The cowboy's shoulder burned with another wound, his vision blurring at the edges, but his stance never broke. At last, the leader stepped forward again, fury in his voice. "Enough of this. Burn them out." Settlers rushed forward with torches, flames licking hungrily at the cabin walls. Heat seared the air, smoke coiling thick. The cowboy knew the cabin would not hold. His sanctuary, his prison of grief, was dying in fire. He looked at Mai, her face streaked with soot, her eyes blazing with defiance. He looked at the warrior, calm even in the face of flames. In that instant, choice became clarity. This was no longer about survival alone. It was about defiance, about standing against the weight of hate and fear. Out the back, he said, voice rough. They moved as one. The warrior kicked open the rear wall, with splintering under his strength. Smoke billowed, flames snapping at their heels. They slipped into the trees, shadows swallowed by shadows. Behind them, the cabin roared with fire, its walls collapsing in a storm of sparks. The settlers shouted, some giving chase, others staring at the blaze as if it were victory itself. The forest became a labyrinth of smoke and shadow. The cowboy led them, wounded but unyielding, his breath ragged. Mai followed close, her hand gripping his arm when his steps faltered. The warrior ranged behind, silent sentinel, cutting down any who drew too near. At last, they stumbled into a clearing, the sky wide above them. The settlers had slowed, their voices fading into the distance. They were alive, for now. The cowboy dropped to his knees, blood soaking his shirt. Mai knelt beside him, hands frantic as she pressed cloth to his wound. He hissed through his teeth, but did not push her away. Her touch was steady, her eyes fierce. "You live," she said, as if command could bend fate. The warrior stood watch, gaze fixed on the trees. He did not speak, but the set of his shoulders told him the fight was not yet over. Time blurred. The cowboy drifted between pain and clarity, memories of his wife and child flickering like ghosts in the smoke. But when his eyes opened, it was Mai's face he saw, Mai's hands that held him to life. Something shifted in him then, a wound that had long festered breaking open to make room for something new. Not love, not yet, but trust. The settlers did not pursue far. Perhaps fear had cooled their rage, or shame had begun to gnaw at them. Either way, the forest grew silent again, broken only by the hiss of the dying fire in the distance. The warrior finally spoke, his voice low, steady, in words the cowboy barely understood but whose meaning was clear. Go. Leave this place. The cowboy nodded. His cabin was gone, his past burned to ash. There was nothing left to bind him here but graves. He looked at Mai, at the fire in her eyes, the strength she had found in the crucible of violence. She deserved more than running forever. You're free now, he said quietly. She shook her head. Not free. Not yet. But I live. Because you fight. The word struck deep, heavier than bullets. He reached for her hand, rough against delicate fingers, and she did not pull away. For a moment, they simply sat there, two souls battered by the world yet still unbroken. The warrior turned, disappearing into the trees without another word. His presence had been brief, but its mark was indelible. He had given them a chance, and that was enough. When the cowboy rose, he staggered, but Mai was there to steady him. Together, they walked from the clearing, leaving behind smoke, blood, and the ashes of what once was home. Each step carried them farther into the unknown, yet closer to something they had not dared to believe in, renewal. The land stretched wide before them, untamed and merciless. But for the first time in years, the cowboy felt a spark of purpose. He had chosen to stand, and in standing, he had found something worth carrying forward. The settlers would remember this day. Perhaps with shame, perhaps with bitterness. But they had been forced to look upon their cruelty, and in that reflection lay a sliver of change. The cowboy tightened his grip on Mai's hand as they walked into the dawn. He did not know where the path led, only that it was forward. And for the first time in a long time, forward was enough.